All right, well, I think I'm going to get started. Hopefully, we'll have a few more folks join as we're getting started here. But yeah, I'm really excited to see so many folks here tonight for our May 2024 meeting, where we're going to cover the basics of affordable housing financing in Montgomery County and some of the really innovative and exciting work that we do here as a county for affordable housing. So, affordable housing is a really central part of the work that we do at Montgomery for All. When we say that we are committed to building equitable and inclusive communities, that means providing housing options that all people can afford, and that includes people of all incomes. So whether we're talking about production or preservation, anytime we see an affordable housing project, that means that someone, and often someone behind the scenes, had to work really hard to make the numbers work. And so I know that when I started this work a few years ago, I felt really kind of intimidated by a lot of the unfamiliar lingo and technical terms around affordable housing. Things like revolving loan fund, gap financing, LIHTC, what does that stand for? Saying, does it pencil? But I've really grown more comfortable over time with that. And in large part, that's thanks to a lot of the people that you are going to hear from tonight. And so I'm really excited that you'll have the opportunity to learn from them as well. I believe, as Liz said in the chat, that sometimes being a real wonky policy nerd about this stuff can really, really help us out as advocates. And I think on affordable housing specifically, having even a basic understanding of all of the pieces that need to come together to make affordable housing financing work can help us make like really strategic and targeted advocacy choices to support policies that get us closer to surmounting the obstacles that keep us from building the affordable housing we need. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Jane Lyons-Rader, who is the events chair for Montgomery for All, and she will walk us through tonight's agenda.
All
Oh,
right.
and I forgot to introduce myself after all that. Hello, after all that. My name is Carrie Kosicki. I'm the Montgomery Advocacy Manager for the Coalition for Smarter Growth, as well as the proud coordinator of Montgomery for All.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Carrie. Oh, excuse my spouse loudly digging into the chip bag. There, in the virtual world, the kitchen table is kind of the best we've got here. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really excited about this event. We are going to first start off by sharing a little bit about Montgomery for All. It's a spiel that you've probably heard before. We'll just hit the highlights. We'll share a little bit about what we're working on and what the county's working on as it relates to one of the big issues right now, attainable housing. And then we'll also get some remarks from County Council President Andrew Friedson, who will be able to share some updates about what's been happening recently with the budget as it relates to affordable housing. Some really exciting things happening there. And then we'll go into our presentations. We will hear a Affordable Housing Financing 101 from Patrick McAnaney. Did I say that right, Patrick?
You did.
Okay, great. I thought I knew how, but then I said it and I got worried. From Patrick McAnaney, and then from Chris Gillis about specifically some of the affordable housing financing tools that exist in Montgomery County. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. If you're able to put your questions in the chat as we go, we'll be collecting those questions and saving them for later so that we can ask them. But as you think of them, feel free to put them in the chat there. But please keep yourself on mute, and also please try to keep discussion in the chat to a minimum. With Montgomery for All, we like to keep the focus on the presentations and what's happening in the Zoom meeting. So if things get too back and forth in the chat, we will turn off the chat so that you can only message the speakers. So that's your warning. And I think that that's all the housekeeping for the moment. So with that, I'll go into what is Montgomery for All. So we are a grassroots group organized by the Coalition for Smarter Growth, which is a larger regional nonprofit advocacy organization, but we are a membership-based grassroots group. And our mission is to create a more affordable, equitable, environmentally sustainable, prosperous county through better land use, housing, and transit decisions. We started in 2019 to advocate around the Thrive 2050 general plan. And now it's pretty incredible that we are over 225 members strong. So our platform includes allowing more housing options, protecting vulnerable communities, equitable, safe access to amenities, education, economic opportunity, building a world-class transit network, and a lot more. You can learn more on our website, Montgomery4all.org. And when you go to the website, you can also become a member for the extremely low price of $5 a year. So please join us. You can also, if you don't want to give us $5, that's fine. You can still sign up for email updates so that you can stay involved in all the things that we're doing and all the events that we host. So with that, oh, here we go. Sorry, a little bit more about us. In order to win these policy and advocacy campaigns, we work with and pressure elected officials to make decisions that will help to further our mission and our goals. We engage with long-term planning efforts. So we work closely with MNC PPC, Montgomery Planning Board, the Montgomery Planning Department, as well as other people who are working behind the scenes to craft the policies that will move us forward. And we're building a community of advocates. We host, I mean, I say this as events chair, but really great events. You can see just a few pictures here, and those events often have pretty incredible speakers like the ones you'll hear from tonight. Lots of elected officials and decision makers, and opportunities to really get to know your community. And to me, that is my favorite part of Montgomery for All, is the community that we've been able to build through it. You know, if you feel disconnected from your community and wish that you ran into more people that you knew while out on the street, Montgomery for All is a great way to do that. I see Montgomery for All folks around all the time. So it's a really special organization, and I'm grateful to everybody who's a part of it. And now I will hand it back over to Carrie to provide some updates on the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative.
Yeah, so as many of you know, on March 21st, the Planning Board held two public listening sessions on the Attainable Housing Strategies draft. It was really great. We had really great turnout. We counted 35 of the 46 speakers in support of attainable housing, including many Montgomery for All members. So thank you to everyone who was a part of that. And so just to give you kind of a quick update on where it is now, the Planning Board has held 2 work sessions so far on the draft recommendations. The first was on April 11th and covered medium scale housing, which is basically like up to small apartment buildings, 19 units or less. And on the 25th of April, they held a work session on small scale housing, which is recommendations related to things like duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. Really quickly, something that I'm excited about after reviewing the recap of the medium scale housing work session is that Montgomery for All had in our comments asked the Planning Board to look into expanding where like the medium scale housing is allowed to be kind of in more locations than was initially recommended, like near transit, and also to kind of examine ways that we can make sure that the review process is not like so cumbersome that we don't see projects get built. So both of those recommendations, you know, having a less restrictive review process and looking at more transit-oriented locations where we can locate medium-scale housing are things that the Planning Board has asked planning staff to look into. So that is really good news. Upcoming dates of interest: on May 16th, the Planning Board has its next work session, which will cover large-scale recommendations, large-scale housing, and other policies. For May 30th and June 6th, they have wrap-up work sessions scheduled. And then after that, the final report, as approved by the Planning Board, will be sent to the Council. And at some point this summer, there will be a Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee briefing. I see we have a couple people on that call who know a lot about that committee, and I'm sure we'll hear some updates about that as well. But you know, obviously we'll hear from me, we'll hear from other folks in Montgomery for All about the next steps, you know, that we will be taking to advocate for attainable housing. But right now, I was really grateful, really excited to see so many people come out to speak in support, and I'm excited about what comes next.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Let me try to go to the next slide. It's not working. Hold on. Maybe that's because we don't have any additional slides. Yes, I think that is it. All
That'll be
right.
it.
So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen there, and now I have the pleasure of introducing the Montgomery County Council President, Andrew Friedson. He is the District 1 council member and also the chair of the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee, which is a really important committee for our issues. And I could go on and on and on about all of the different things that he has led on as it relates to housing and planning and all of the things that we advocate for. Any advocacy win that we've had as Montgomery for All has had Andrew Friedson behind it as a champion. So I'm very glad that he's able to join us tonight and provide us some updates about what's happening related to especially affordable housing at the county council right now. So thank you so much for being here, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for all that you do to advocate for housing and for affordable housing in Montgomery County throughout the region. I'm just thrilled to be here. We're at a major moment when it comes to housing in Montgomery County, across the state, throughout the region. We are not nearly where we need to be, but we are so much further than I think anybody might have thought, even when I was running for office. I ran in District 1 and kind of the heart of the opposition of some of the housing initiatives that had recently been undertaken amid the rubble of the destructive nature of the conversation of the West Bard Plan and the Downtown Bethesda Plan, two hugely significant but controversial plans. At the time, at the aftermath of the first part of the Purple Line conversation, as an unabashed supporter of the Purple Line as a critical east-west connection, and I kind of challenged convention and said, I think things are turning here. And I also was the youngest candidate and became the youngest council member, but the youngest candidate in the district that is the oldest demographic district in the county. And so all of those things seemed to make no sense. The unabashed supporter of housing, running in a district and at a time when people thought that the community was down on those issues. And it turned out the bet was right, that actually there were more people who actually did care about housing. There were more people, maybe not those that were showing up to all the meetings, but there were plenty of people who were concerned about the basic premise that their children couldn't afford to live in the same community that they raised them in, even with the same job, even with the same, circumstances. They had no chance to live in the same neighborhood that they raised them in. That this economy that we had built in Montgomery County, this idea that one government salary in my grandparents' day, when they raised children in the area, that could afford you to live in pretty much any community from a housing perspective. There was restrictions otherwise for ugly reasons, but from a financial economic perspective, one government job could afford you to live in any community. When I grew up, two government jobs, two professional government jobs could afford you to live in really any part of Montgomery County, or one private sector, type job: dentist, doctor, lawyer, small business owner. Today, two government salaries, the most senior level of government salaries, can't afford you to live in almost any part of Montgomery County on its own. And that is a fundamental shift. And so for a housing crisis that has ripped every single suburban and urban community across the country, and we're coming to grips with that, it has hit ours particularly hard because we had banked our entire economy off of the stability of the federal government. And that stability doesn't work with skyrocketing housing costs that have just completely gone above inflation and gone above wage increases. Certainly all wages, but particularly public sector wages. So we have a real challenge. For 30 years, we really didn't build much housing at all. We have now finally started to build the housing we should have been building all along, but we've got a lot of catching up to do. because the supply is nowhere close to the demand. And we just have to be honest about that. So what are we doing about it? We're doing a lot. First is changing hearts and minds. I will say that 5 years ago, while I was running, if you had asked me that we would have been able to eliminate the housing moratorium countywide, I would have said that is going to be a very tough sell. But I was proud to lead the effort to end it countywide. This is not a good policy. We shouldn't have it in some parts of the county and not others. We should just get rid of it. And so there was a great proposal, which I appreciated, from the planning department at the time and the planning board, to keep it in Clarksburg, but get rid of it everywhere else. And I said, let's just get rid of it. If this is a bad idea, it's bad public policy. It starves housing and resources for schools. It's bad and worse when it comes to policy. Let's get rid of it. So we got rid of it, and we changed the narrative there. We changed our tax code. I was proud to lead that effort. We used to have a property tax system that was based on a revenue cap. The premise of, like, we already have everything and everyone that we want, and we have to live within our means within the community that we have. And anybody who wants to come in, we don't benefit from them. It reinforced this concept, literally embedded into our tax code, that growth was not a benefit to the community. Housing is not a benefit to the community, it's a burden. And the burden had to pay for itself. This country club style mentality, where the initiation fee goes up each consecutive year, and you have to pay more to get in. And a community that prides itself on being welcoming and inclusive just shouldn't operate that way, shouldn't think that way. And so we have really started to change not just certain policies, but the mentality with which we approach policies. And I'm proud now to say we've come full circle. If you look at where we were in the debates that we had been having, to the Tacoma Park plan, the modern master plan that many of you advocated very strongly on, I was very proud, and we fought off significant opposition from Tacoma Park resident and county executive, among others. But we made the case that every part of Montgomery County needs to be part of the housing solution, that we shouldn't ask for neighboring jurisdictions and neighboring parts of the county, like Silver Spring and like Northwest DC, to provide the housing to absorb the needs of a place like Tacoma Park. The Tacoma Park needed to be part of that. And I'm proud to say that many of the residents in Tacoma Park, most of the residents in Tacoma Park, I think really bought into that idea. And we had this view and this mentality that it was Tacoma Park residents primarily who were opposed to that. And that just wasn't true. It was just that the powers that be for many years were in opposition and were fighting it. And so the political structure has changed, and the municipal government overwhelmingly endorsed the concept of greater density and more housing, which is just a fundamental sea change into the way that we are addressing housing. And now we have a partnership. The governor has stepped up, and he has addressed these issues. We've tried to balance this concept and territorial war of local control, which I obviously care about as a local official. I think that local governments are in a position to address these issues. But let's face it, local governments historically have not been great on these issues, have been part of the barriers and obstacles to build new housing. And so, as I have shared, we have to change that. We have to prove at the local level that we aren't a barrier, that we are the part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I think we're finally moving in that direction. So a couple new topics that we're doing, and then I'll wrap up because you have actual experts here to talk about housing financing, which I know you all care about, although I would geek out on housing financing all day long if I could. Trust me, it's like my favorite topic. But we had the Housing Production Fund, which Hans Dreamer and I led the effort on to create with Housing Opportunities Commission. It's a $100 million fund. It's essentially a revolving fund of construction loans to supercharge the Housing Opportunity Commission pipeline through public-private partnerships. It has been widely acclaimed across the country. In fact, I probably get a phone call or an email at least once a week, usually multiple times a week, from another jurisdiction that wants to meet or interview me to talk about how we did that, both on the political and policy level, but also on the financing level, and why it matters. It's been featured in the New York Times, Vox, I mean, you name it. I mean, people are taking notice, and it's getting recognized, and actually it's being modeled around the country, and it's led to results already. We already opened the laureate. We're opening up a number of other buildings as well. We have 2 more in the pipeline. We'll have more beyond that. Now the state is putting in money to try to get not only us to be able to add funding to our program, but have jurisdictions around the state follow suit. In the heels of that, the vision, the plan had always been, my goal had always been to have a $50 million companion nonprofit preservation fund, so that we were producing new housing, which we desperately need. We can't solve this problem without new housing, period, full stop. But we also need to preserve some of the naturally occurring affordable housing that we have. I'll note that naturally occurring affordable housing today was luxury housing 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70 years ago. So these are not mutually exclusive concepts. But we do need tools, particularly along the Purple Line corridor, and Chris Gillis has been a great leader on this, among others with MHP. But we are finally, after several years of work and trying to figure out, because nonprofit preservation is much more complicated than construction loans with HOC, but we finally figured out a path forward, which is a partnership between HOC, DHCA, and our nonprofit partners. I was really proud to really spearhead that effort. We just approved $20 million in a special appropriation to get that started. And then we're going to have another $30 million to get to the full $50 million this calendar year, in next fiscal year. So we are there. We are doing it. We are making this happen. That would be the most significant preservation effort of any local jurisdiction anywhere. We know in the region, we think in the country. There's no one that can come up with something that we think has done more. And these are additive to the tens of millions of more dollars that we've added to the Housing Initiative Fund. The benefit of both of those funds in particular is they don't hoard low-income housing tax credits that are finite resources. They actually add to the amount of financing that we can do. And so the challenge in housing, besides the ugly conversation oftentimes that we were having, and oppositional conversations that we were having, pitting communities against each other and new residents against old residents, longtime residents. We were also pitting projects against each other. Literally, the financing was limited. And so, Chris Gillis would come in with his organization and he would be fighting against somebody else at their organization to try to say, our project is better. And so we can move it faster. Please fund us. These programs are saying, no, let's get out of the competitive game and let's get into the additive game, because we need not or, but and. It needs to be a yes and all of the above strategy when it comes to housing. So I think that's great. I'll just close on, and I could talk for hours and hours about this stuff, but one other key piece is the zoning text amendments, 2 of them. One I did with Lorianne Sales, the other in partnership with Vice President Stewart. And the first one is to fast track affordable housing projects. If you qualify, basically any affordable housing program that we have or the federal government has, you qualify for 75% reduction in the regulatory review process. We want you to move forward as quickly as humanly possible. Just to give you a sense, the Montgomery Hills project that MHP did, since we've got him here, I asked for some projections on timing of what that could have meant in dollars. That project could have saved about $8 million if it had gone through a refined project. So that's real money. That could have been $8 million to deepen or broaden affordability of that project. It could have been $8 million for the next project so that they could start on their next project, and it would have brought it online sooner, most importantly, to people who desperately need the housing. The one with Lorianne Sales, the Faith ZTA facilitating affordable, inclusive, transformational housing. That helps to make it easier for faith-based organizations to build housing on their properties. We have all these mission-based organizations that show up to the council with signs and placards saying, please do more for affordable housing, who are sitting on vacant parking lots and huge properties without any money and without the tools and the regulatory process to actually help them turn that mission and advocacy into actual benefits to human beings. And so we have made it easier to do that. And we're really excited about the response that we've gotten so far. I think that's going to bear a lot of fruit, particularly those two initiatives. So lots going on in Montgomery County. I've been proud to lead these efforts. The housing targets that we're moving forward on, we're going to be the first local jurisdiction, we're the first jurisdiction anywhere actually, to have housing targets beyond 2030. We're setting them up for 2040 and 2050. That's where really the policy starts now. The policies we needed for 2030 housing have already happened. Now it's projects that we need for 2030, but the policies that we need, the land use decisions that we're going to make, we need to start today for housing that we're going to want and need in 2040 and 2050. We need to start planning for that. And so we're setting ourselves up to do that, to follow what DC has done with local housing targets for 2030, but then really being cutting edge and thinking about 2040 and 2050. So I'm really excited about what's happening. That plays directly into the attainable housing strategy as well, and will be part of that conversation. My hope is it'll be part of every master plan conversation moving forward as well. So we will have an idea of what is the housing that we said we needed, and how do we hold ourselves accountable to actually get there. So with that, thank you so much for all you do. Thanks for inviting me to join, and I'm just really excited to be a partner in this work.
Thank you so much, Council President Friedson. Really appreciate it, and all the work that you're doing. It is certainly a lot.
That's why we invite you. Next time we'll ask you for slides too. So
I wanted to take a moment before we move into the presentations to recognize Delegate Janelle Wilkins, District 20 representative. She's here with us tonight. I'm sure she is still recovering from a busy session in Annapolis that ended a month ago. And she is a huge champion for affordable housing and especially renters' rights, tenants' rights. There were a lot of big wins on that in this legislative session. So shout out to Janelle for all of your work on that. And I believe also just a quick shout out to Planning Commissioner James Hedrick, who was here as well. Thank you for all of your work on attainable housing strategies and everything else that you do at the Planning Board. And then a final shout out to Gwen Wright, the former Planning Department Director of Montgomery County, who won a big award recently, has been winning many awards for all of the excellent work that she did while she was Planning Director. So a stacked cast of attendees tonight. And with that, I will
better have a really good Q&A with all these folks in the
right. Exactly. And with that, I am pleased to introduce and hand it over to Patrick McAnaney. He is the Director of Development with Somerset Development, to do a general overview of Affordable Housing Finance 101. If you haven't been following his series about affordable housing in Greater Washington, the blog, go and check that out. Maybe either Carrie or I can go find that link and put it in the chat. But that's what inspired me to reach out to him and to see if he could translate those blog posts into a like webinar type of thing, because it's just been so helpful, even for me who works in affordable housing, to better understand all the intricacies that come with developing it. So thank you so much for being here tonight, Patrick. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jane and Carrie, for having me. Again, my name is Patrick McAnaney. I'm with Somerset Development. We are a DC-based company, a mission-driven company that specializes in building affordable housing, both in the district itself as well as in Maryland. Traditionally been very active in Baltimore, but certainly have a lot of interest in Montgomery County as well. I was actually grew up in downtown Bethesda and proud product of Montgomery County Public Schools. So very excited to be here tonight with you all and share a little bit of kind of the background. We'll go pretty in the weeds here on affordable housing finance, but for those of you who kind of really want to understand the tools and a little bit of the math, I hope it will be interesting. So let me just get this set up. All right, so this talk is going to have 3 parts. We're going to go over kind of what the core financing tools we tend to use for affordable housing projects are. I'm going to go through an example of what that would take to build a 3-bedroom affordable apartment in a hypothetical scenario. And then I want to talk a little bit about a conversation that comes up pretty frequently, which is affordable versus market rate projects, right? The idea of are these projects in competition with each other, or do they actually cooperate together? And so to start off with understanding the tools, the basic place to start is just imagine how you go out and buy a home. When you go out and you buy a home, you're going to have a debt, you're going to get a mortgage, and you're going to put on a down payment, equity. And understanding your debt and your equity is the same thing with how you start understanding building an affordable building. So when you're buying a house, the mortgage you can afford depends on what your income is, and as we've all seen in the news recently, whatever interest rates are. And when you're building a building, it's basically the same thing. It depends on the income that the building can produce, the rent minus the expenses. And the key thing to understand about affordable projects is because you have lower rents, you have lower income, so you get smaller mortgages. And so you have less debt that you can carry. Now, on the equity side, when you're buying a home, again, it's the money you save for a down payment. That's the equity you're putting into the house. When you're out building a building, you usually have to go and raise equity from third parties. So you go out to institutional investors, often they're pension funds or all sorts of different players in the market. And the key thing to understand is that those investors are going to look for a pretty decent rate of return, right? If they wanted to own real estate, they could also just go out and invest in real estate stocks in the stock market, which is a little bit safer. It's not tied to one single building with all that specific risk that can be involved. So they're often looking for a pretty high rate of return beyond what you would get in the stock market. And in the affordable world, those equity returns just don't exist. They're not sufficient enough to attract those institutional investors. So you usually have to look for other sources of equity financing. And the most common one that we use nationally is called the low-income housing tax credit. Now, the way the low-income housing tax credit works, it was created as part of federal tax reform in 1986. And the goal was basically to fill that gap, to provide equity investment that was specifically for affordable housing projects. And so investors will go ahead and provide equity investment to build a new building. And in exchange, they get to write off their corporate taxes. And part of the reason that it's worth it for these investors to do it, it's usually banks who have requirements under what's called the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA. And that was basically an anti-redlining federal law that said if banks are out lending to different groups, they have to make sure that a portion of their investments are targeted to support community development efforts. And investing in low-income housing tax credits is generally one way that banks can fulfill those requirements. So as I said, the way it works is the investor, the bank usually, will go ahead and provide the equity investment in tranches during construction, and then they get credits back. The amount of credits a project is eligible for depends basically on the total development cost, how much it costs to build the building. And there's some ineligible uses, transaction fees, legal fees that usually don't count as part of those costs. And the investor then, they're actually a co-owner of the property with you. So usually they would be what you call a limited partner. They're pretty quiet, silent co-owner. And then the developer is the general partner who's really managing the construction and then owning and operating the building long-term. And so usually there's a split in the cash flow that comes out of the building between the developer and the bank. The way the timeline works is the investor gets those credits back for 10 years. So once the building is built, it's in operation, it's filled up with tenants, then for the next 10 years, the investor gets to write off the credit amount from their corporate taxes. And the property has to stay in compliance for a 15-year period. So if the IRS comes and finds you weren't actually operating this according to the rules, they can revoke those credits during that period. And the goal of this is essentially to create internal accountability mechanisms. The banks, obviously, the investors are very scared of losing those credits. And so they then have an incentive to police the developer and make sure that they're all following the rules and operating the building properly. Generally, the departments then have to remain affordable for 30 years. So it's that 15-year compliance period. And then there'll be a covenant that goes for another 15 years. So the basic standard term of the tax credit is 30 years of affordability. And usually investors, they just look at their investment as a 15-year investment, right? They put the money in up front, they get the credits for 10 years. They usually want to stay in the remaining 5 years to make sure that there's no compliance issue where they could, have a bill come back to them. And then usually they want to get out. So usually investor kind of looks at the tax credit as a 15-year investment. And after this program was created in 1986, it's basically grown to be the predominant federal form of affordable housing finance in the country. So what this graph shows are kind of the four traditional programs that we have. Public housing, which has kind of been on a slow, steady decline for many decades in terms of the total number of units served, but still, a decent amount of affordable units throughout the country. And then you have project-based Section 8 vouchers, which are basically operating subsidies tied to specific buildings. So it's Section 8 buildings that are usually kind of all with a contract from HUD to provide some ongoing rental assistance. You have tenant vouchers, which you may have heard of, which kind of travel with tenants. They can take a voucher and go unit to unit and get some support for their rent. But LIHTC has now passed all of them. So it is now the largest program overall. And it's not unlike those programs which are managed by HUD. This is just kind of managed through the tax code to the IRS. So it works a little differently. But obviously, all four of these programs are still in use today, but the growth trajectory you can see is pretty clear. But the key thing to understand is that mortgages and tax credits, usually on their own, are still not sufficient. Even if you can line up those tax credits and you get a regular mortgage from a bank, you still are going to have what we call a gap between the cost it takes to build the building and the funding sources available. So a lot of the work that affordable housing developers do is trying to fill that final piece of gap. And there's usually three ways you can look to do it. One is to get a grant, just kind of someone giving you money for for reason or another. The second is an operating subsidy, kind of an ongoing assistance, a payment to the building. And the third is subordinate debt, what you could call a second mortgage, but basically another form of debt beyond your regular mortgage on a building that can be used to help pay for some of those costs. So I'll go through each of these a little bit more. So grants, usually it'll depend on a specific aspect of the project. Maybe you're going for some specific green building goals, or you're serving some very specific target populations. You can go out and seek grants from private foundations. Some local state governments will run grant programs. And there are also federal grant programs that HUD runs that are pretty large programs. And so you can apply to those additional tranches of money from HUD. And often as a developer, you're just trying to line up as many sources as possible. We have one property we built years ago. We had to have 16 different funding sources to get it built. So that's just kind of an idea of how you're running around looking for different pots of money. Operating subsidies usually come in two varieties. One, as I mentioned earlier, are vouchers. And so for a building, these are going to be project-based vouchers. They're tied to the building itself. And the idea there is that the tenant pays some portion of their income in rent, and the government is stepping in and paying for the rest. So you'd usually have kind of a long-term contract with the government agency, and they then are giving this rental supplement. And what that does, it boosts your income for your building, so you can then go and get a larger mortgage. You can support larger debt, and that reduces your gap financing need by adding more debt to the building. The other common form of an operating subsidy is a tax abatement, right? If you get an abatement from your local jurisdiction that you don't have to pay any property taxes or reduce property taxes, that takes away a significant expense from the building. And so by lowering your expenses, it has the same effect. It boosts your income, and then you can get a larger mortgage. And so then you have more debt the project can support. The third common form is subordinate debt. And as I mentioned, this is basically a second mortgage. So you'd still have your regular mortgage from a bank, and then you would get kind of a second loan that would be paid behind in the kind of pecking order of the creditors. It's paid off afterward, and also helps to cover the cost of construction. And so a lot of local jurisdictions are doing this now. There's a federal program as well, where they basically create revolving loan funds. So the local entity will provide a loan, you add that to your capital stack, and over time you pay back some of the proceeds of that loan from the cash flow from the building. So those funds get recycled and then can be used for other projects in the future. And the key usually is that these are much better than regular market terms, right? So it would be lower interest rates, more flexible repayment terms, just because this is not a product that the market on its own would naturally provide. So just to see what that would look like in practice, this is what we generally call in development our sources and uses. So your uses on the right-hand side are all the costs it takes to build the building. The cost to buy the land, the cost to actually physically construct the building, the cost to pay your architect, to get your permits, to pay all the lawyers, all the financing fees that go with getting a mortgage or anything else. Having reserves, and these are very important. You need both reserves during the construction period in case you have cost overruns and try as we might, we almost always do have cost overruns. And then you also need reserves ongoing for your operating budget in case you have any unforeseen circumstances come up. And then finally, you do need to budget some money for developer fee. Developers do need to make money as well to stay in business. So similar to the way you would pay your contractor to build the building, your architect to design the building, there's usually a set developer fee as well. And so
Can I ask a question about the previous slide?
Just one quick question, but we'll try
Yeah.
to save most of the questions for the end.
Okay, sorry, this is very specific to the previous slide on the subordinated debt, but if the debt is subordinated to the mortgage, so only gets paid back after the mortgage, wouldn't a local fund for subordinated debt barely turn over because of the length of the mortgage? Or are you counting on some sort of refinancing that would pay off the subordinated debt and wrap it into a mortgage?
So it usually depends on the terms. So usually it will be paid out of the cash flow that's left over after you pay your first mortgage. So usually you will size your first mortgage so that you're still having some cash flow. You want to have a buffer that you're not taking, every single penny.
Got it. Thank you.
Pay back. And then also it can be paid back when a building is sold or if you have a refinancing. So there's different ways, but it does not turn over as robustly as a regular bank mortgage does, certainly. So anyways, going back to we talk about the uses on the right-hand side, and then an example of what we call your funding stack. So your sources might be your regular first mortgage from a bank, some tax credit equity that you're getting from a tax credit investor. Maybe you've gone and lined up a green building grant for some certifications that you're planning to do for your building, and then some subordinate debt from your local government. And the goal, of course, is you have to make sure that your funding sources equal your total development costs. We call balancing the sources and uses in order for the project to go forward. So to give you an example of how this works in practice, let's look at an actual, well, not actual, it's a hypothetical 3-bedroom apartment, but we'll put some actual numbers on this. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that we're going to throw into the model. We're going to assume that we're looking at 1,000 square foot apartment. The affordability level we're going to assume is affordability is generally set as a percentage of area median income, which changes every year. HUD publishes those numbers on an annual basis. We're going to assume this is a 50% AMI unit. And so you're looking at it for a family of 4, about $71,000 household income. For the building type, we're assuming this is low-rise wood frame apartment, maybe about 4 stories. So we'll say about $245 per square foot in construction costs. The numbers have been all over the place recently. I have constantly changed these slides. We'll also assume that there is an operating subsidy. So we can assume that this property, through some local government policy, is getting 100% property tax abatement, which is often available for nonprofits. And we're also assuming some unrealistic assumptions here in the model just to start. We're assuming that the acquisition cost is 0. So the land is given away for free, and I'll come back to this a little later. We're also assuming for mortgage rates, about a 5.5% rate, amortized over 40 years. Generally, commercial loan rates will be a little lower than your standard 30-year home purchase rate, although based on today's rates, this number is a little optimistic, but let's say we're a year from now in a slightly better world. So we're also going to assume on the operating budget side, based on that 50% AMI number, we're looking at a gross rent of about $1,960 is how much the tenant would pay. And we also have to deduct what you assume they're going to pay in utilities as well. So there's kind of what we call a utility allowance. You deduct that amount. So then you as the developer are only getting $1,810 a month in rent. So that comes out to $21,000 in annual rent. And let's assume that you're operating your building at about $9,000 per unit in expenses. So that means you're operating an income of about $12,720. So with that, we can start to build our model. So the total square footage for this unit, I said the unit itself is 1,000 square feet. You have to remember that there's space for hallways, elevators, lobby, all that. So the total net square footage comes out to, we're actually looking at closer to 1,200. And again, I said we're assuming a $245 cost for that square foot. We're assuming, again, contingency, keeping those reserves. We'll assume we might have some cost overruns along the way. We'll peg it for now at 7%. And we'll also assume that paying the architect, all of our permitting costs, other soft costs are equal to 15% of the construction budget. and that the financing costs, a lot of this is the interest you're going to pay on the debt during construction, various fees, will peg at 12%. So once you do all the math, the square footage times the construction cost plus all this added in, we're looking at a development cost for this unit of $386,000. And now we have to figure out how much we have to meet that cost. So again, I said we have a assumed net operating income, NOI, of $12,720. And so with those debt assumptions I mentioned earlier, that can support a first mortgage of about $171,000. And also, if we do a calculation for the tax credits, I won't go into that because it gets pretty complicated. But we can assume that based on those costs, this project could generate another $127,000 in tax credit equity. So what that means is that between your bank mortgage and your tax credits, you have $299,000 to fund your project. The challenge, of course, is that, as I mentioned, it takes $386,000 to build your project. So what you can see here already is you have a gap, about $87,000 for this one unit. And again, there's some key assumptions we have in here. You'll see on the right-hand side on the uses, we're assuming you somehow got the land for free. The land acquisition is zero. And we're assuming that someone out of the very goodness of their heart is doing all this work for free, that the developer fee is $0, which are, of course, not realistic assumptions. And so this is really kind of the key takeaway from just doing the math, is it takes more to build this affordable 3-bedroom apartment than that unit produces in rent to pay for its construction. And so once you factor in the land costs and the developer fee that I didn't mention, you're actually looking at a gap of about $200,000 per unit. And that's roughly right now in the district and in similar jurisdictions, what you have to fill in order to make these projects move forward. There are a lot of other factors that can affect the gap. Number one, of course, is construction costs. And a key thing to understand, too, is that taller buildings, once you switch materials, they do get more expensive on a per square foot basis. So once you're switching from wood frame construction up to steel and concrete, you do have a higher cost per square foot. And so usually you have to kind of factor in how much benefit you can get for given levels of increasing your density. Another key factor, this one we have to think about a lot in DC, is what we call Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements. Davis-Bacon is a federal law that sets wage requirements for all sorts of federal projects, and uniquely for us, the District of Columbia. So only DC and federal financing are subject to Davis-Bacon. And normally up to a 4-story building, the Davis-Bacon wages are pretty similar to the standard market wages. But there's a different classification system that kicks in once you go 5 stories up. And that usually adds a very hefty premium, usually 10 to 12% of your construction costs. Another thing to factor in is underground parking. Obviously, it can be very nice from a layout standpoint. You're not wasting space. We all usually want underground parking where we can do it, but it is extremely expensive and often runs $50,000 to $70,000 per space to build. But it's not just construction costs that have an impact. One is deeper income targeting. And so when you're looking at deeper levels of affordability, we always want to make sure that we're building affordable housing for folks, even at the very low end of the income spectrum, who often have the greatest need. But again, as you go down, the deeper affordability and your rents go down, your income goes down, so your mortgages get smaller. And so usually that will create a much larger gap. And so you try and offset as much as possible with operating subsidies, especially at that very, very deeply affordable level. But deeper income targeting is always definitely more expensive. And the other one that I'm sure we've all heard about a lot recently are higher interest rates. As high interest rates jumped up in the last few years, that meant mortgages were smaller, and that actually led to a huge surge in the gap financing costs per unit, because as mortgages went down, of course, the gap you needed went up. So the last thing I just want to touch on a little bit is this question of how affordable and market rate housing relate to each other. Are they in competition when you're looking at any given spot? Do you want to build a market rate building there or affordable building, or do they actually reinforce each other? And the key thing to understand about this is when you understand land value, the way it works is that a single piece of land is exclusive, right? If I look at one vacant piece of land, I can only build one thing on it. I could build a farm, I could build a building, or I could build a park, but that's the only thing it can be. And so the way we determine land value is what you call the highest and best use. You run all the models to see based on what that use could, what it would cost to build and the amount of income it would produce, what would be the land value that results. And so that's how appraisers assess land value, is they look for whatever the highest and best use would be, and then that determines what the value of the land is. Because when any normal person wants to sell their land, they're going to want to sell it at the highest price. And as a result, you get different values the different sorts of projects can pay for the site. So again, the land price is kind of the output. You take all the other factors in, the construction costs, how much rent it will produce, what it will cost to operate, and the land is the output you spit out. So as an example, you can think of one land where an apartment building could pay 5 million for the land, an office building could pay 4, and a factory could pay 2. Then what happens is the land is valued at 5 million because the expected highest and best use is an apartment building. And those other projects, they can't pay 5 million for that land. If their model wouldn't work financially. And so those projects, it becomes financially unviable for them to move forward, and they can't bid on that land successfully. And you can also look at that for the same type of use. So if you just look at the same apartment building, we're assuming you construct it for the same way, you have the same financing costs, but just if you look at different levels of rents. So this is an example I've created of hypothetical 180 unit 4-story building, and just looking at 3 different levels of rents, right? One is 2,400 for a 1-bedroom. The second one is 2,000 for a 1-bedroom. And the third is 1,800 for a 1-bedroom. So these are not huge changes in rents we're talking about. And you hold every other factor constant, your construction cost, or interest rate, your equity return. The resulting land value difference that those 3 rents spit out, project 1, the land, they could pay 17.5 million. Project 2 could only pay 5 million. And project 3 actually couldn't pay anything. It's negative, and there's a gap that you have to fill, going back to what we talked about before. But so what happens is that land then is officially worth, going to project 1, it's worth 17.5 million, and the other projects are unviable. They can't move forward without some sort of financial support. And so that is really the reason why in expensive markets, you're not seeing kind of middle income housing produced naturally, that all these projects, they have to outbid each other. And so as a result, as long as there's demand at that high end, that can drive up the land value, and then only those projects moving forward. But of course, as you increase supply, that can help to lower rents overall, which starts to bring down land values and makes both market rate and affordable housing projects more viable, because the land values come down, it's easier to fill the gap that results. So when you increase supply, you actually do make it easier to finance affordable housing projects, because as you bring down land values, the gap per unit that you need goes down. And so as a result, even though we think of affordable and market rate housing in competition sometimes, and certainly in some activist circles, people treat it that way, the reality is that they actually need each other. You need to build market rate housing to help support affordable housing. And I always think that there's an interesting illustration of this. This is a somewhat outdated map from Trulios. So sadly, they don't have these anymore, so I can't pull up a more recent one that's Montgomery County specific. But it's always interesting. You can look at certainly the line of segregation and difference in land values in the city, but you can also see how in areas where you have increased supply, you also have a little more affordability. Anyway, to conclude, the key thing is that if you want to build affordable housing, you need significant amounts of subsidy, usually both a combination of federal and local subsidies. And even when you remove speculation, the concept of land value, or developer profit, which is the idea of the developer fee, usually you still need subsidy to make these projects work. And also affordable housing development, we are always hit by macroeconomic conditions as well. We're not immune to the challenges that we've all been working through the different economic shocks in recent years. And that's certainly made an impact on this industry as well. And again, market rate and affordable housing, they're not actually either or. They can work together to help lower land prices and make more affordable housing projects move forward. So with that, I will conclude and turn things back over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was great. I think that's as simple as a dense topic can be made, but also it's still very dense. So I look forward to everybody's questions. No question is too dumb to ask. I think we're going to save that for the very end, though, after Chris's presentation. And so with that, since I want to make sure we can get to questions, I will move over to Chris Gillis, who is the Director of Policy and Neighborhood Development with Montgomery Housing Partnership. So Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So good evening, everyone. Good to be with an audience of people that cares about affordable housing. So again, like Jane was saying, my name is Chris Gillis. My title is Director of Policy and Neighborhood Development at MHP. So I wear two hats at MHP. One is I oversee MHP's policies activities, and we're most active at the Montgomery County level and at the state level in Maryland. And then I also oversee our community development work. A little bit about MHP. We are the largest nonprofit affordable housing provider in Montgomery County. So we own and manage about 30 apartment communities and totaling about 3,000 apartment units. And for most of our history, we're about a 35-year-old organization. For most of our history, our bread and butter was kind of buying up older apartment buildings, fixing them up and maintaining their affordability. But in recent years, I would say maybe it's kind of a 50-50 split with our kind of pipeline activity, where maybe 50% is preservation work and the other 50% is now new construction. And I think during my presentation, I'll touch on a couple of our new construction projects because they're really relevant to how affordable housing is financed here locally. So that kind of leads me directly into my presentation. Patrick gave a great kind of overall overview of how affordable housing is financed, all across the country. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on how affordable housing is financed here locally in Montgomery County. So Andrew stole a little bit of my thunder, but thankfully not too much. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but I do want to tip my cap to him because actually when he was a freshman council member, the only funding tool that Montgomery County had or financing tool they had was the Housing Initiative Fund, that first tool you see there. And during these last 4 or 5 years, Montgomery County now has about five different tools that it uses to finance. So if you're like me, sometimes you just hear in the news how bad things are with the affordable housing crisis, and you can get a little bit impatient or frustrated that we're not making enough progress. But I think if you're not paying attention, it can be easy to feel that way, that we're not making progress. But I think this screen alone will show you, like my presentation will show you, that we have made a lot of progress here locally. And when I started with MHP a little over 5 years ago, the District of Columbia, they were really the high watermark for local jurisdictions supporting affordable housing. And now Montgomery County is actually probably leapfrogged the District of Columbia. The district, they've really cut back on their funding for affordable housing, and Montgomery County is doing a lot of new and innovative things like Councilmember Friedson was talking about. So yeah, these are some of the tools that I'll touch on in my presentation here. And the first is the Housing Initiative Fund, or it's called the HIF for short. This is Montgomery County's housing trust fund. So lots of local jurisdictions all across the country have housing trust funds, and I think it's something that's easy to take for granted because it's been around for so long here in Montgomery County. It's almost 35 years old. But not every local jurisdiction in the area in Maryland even has them, as some are talking about creating them. I think maybe Howard County just created one a year or two ago. Baltimore County, I think they've struggled to create one. Prince George's County, they've had one that's kind of nominally funded for a number of years. So for a long time, this has really been kind of the workhorse and of like kind of affordable housing financing here in Montgomery County. And it's really the most flexible tool that we still have. A lot of these newer tools that I'll touch on, they're for very specific uses, but the Housing Initiative Fund, it can be used for acquisition, it can be used for rehab, it can be used for new construction. So it's definitely the most flexible tool that we have. And as this the fourth bullet point notes there, the most important thing is that it provides below market rate loans for projects. So whereas currently, like if you're going through a traditional bank, you might get a loan rate of like 7%. What my boss, our MHP president, Rob Goldman, kind of says is like the gold standard is 2% money. So we're always looking for kind of money that we can get for a 2% interest rate. At that rate, it kind of balances out some of the higher interest rates that will be part of that capital stack that Patrick talked about, where we're going to have some traditional banks providing financing. So when we get that kind of low interest rate money, we can make a project work. And traditionally, the HIF, it provides longer term financing for projects. So say like 30 years, kind of like a traditional mortgage, whereas some of the newer tools we have are shorter terms. And on average, the county now provides about $64,000 subsidy for every affordable unit that's built. And that's been going up a lot. Before the pandemic, it was about $55,000. And because of interest rate increases, because of construction costs going up, this is really going up. There's some projects that are going to close this year, and the average is closer to $90,000 now, the subsidy that Montgomery County is providing. So that just kind of goes to show you how much it's increased just in the last 4 or 5 years. And the county has, had to kind of be flexible about, providing more for the same number of units. The next tool that I'll touch on is the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund. This launched a couple years ago, back in 2022. And whereas the HIF provides like that longer term financing, the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund is for short-term financing, say like 3 years. And it's mostly meant for acquiring properties like NOAA properties, naturally occurring affordable housing properties, where there's a risk of losing that affordability forever. And it's very unique in that the county kind of seeded $14 million, and then the county itself is not administering the fund. It's using a third party called the National Housing Trust, and they're acting as, you may have heard of this term, a community development financial institution, and they're kind of serving that purpose where the county provided $14 million, but the National Housing Trust, they're leveraging private funding that they're bringing to the table too. So generally speaking, they're bringing about 3 times the money that Montgomery County is. And so it creates like, a bigger pool of money that can be used for acquiring affordable housing properties. So, by that math, it'd be about, $60 million that is roughly available for acquiring properties. And the great thing about this is, Patrick talked about revolving funds. This revolves very quickly because, again, it's a short-term financing. So, so it's meant for, a few years, and then you have to identify your long-term financing or put that into place. So I think there's already been some kind of cycling out of this money already, even though it's only, the program is only 2 years old. And just to give you an example, MHP, we acquired a property called the Rollingwood Apartment Community. It's in the Littonsville area of Silver Spring, like near the future Purple Line station. And we got like a very small opportunity fund loan, I think a little over $2 million. And that just, helps even things out and, makes the financing possible. One thing I did want to just kind of going back to the, I forgot about some notes I have here. With the HIF, some of the biggest projects, like the newer construction projects, say like a new multifamily building that's going to be 200 units now. One project alone might get upwards of $20 million in loans from Montgomery County. So even if Montgomery County is saying like providing $100 million in overall funding, that could go really quickly when you have a big multifamily property and it's going to need $20 million in loans from Montgomery County government. So it really is important that, it's not enough to just have, tens of millions of dollars, because it might only be enough to fund 1 or 2 projects. But Montgomery County has really risen to the occasion there. And then one thing that the HIF does not support is pre-development costs, and that's a huge cost for affordable housing development, where now it's not unusual in pre-development, it's everything that goes before you're ready to construct the building. Like Patrick was talking about, the engineers, the architects, the land use attorneys, that can cost easily $3, $4, $5 million now. And that's really risky because usually an affordable housing provider, they're kind of using their own equity, their own money to make that happen. And there's no guarantee sometimes, going through the entitlements process, or especially if you're going for low-income housing tax credits, that you're going to get the financing. So it's something you have to weigh in terms of, affordable housing providers, not taking on too many projects, because pre-development costs, county government, it used to be like decades ago, the county government would provide some pre-development funding. That's not really the case anymore. Sometimes you can get some either corporate, philanthropic, or even some state grants to help support pre-development costs, but generally speaking, it's not really available at the county level. And yeah, I think one thing that's also important to kind of point out with the Opportunity Fund is, I think right now you're seeing a lot more partnerships between affordable housing developers. Like at Rollingwood, the acquisition costs were just massive. And we, for the first time, had to partner with a for-profit affordable housing provider on a project, whereas before we were kind of the sole developer or, acquisition of a property. So I think that's something because of the high acquisition costs here in Montgomery County, That's something probably you're going to see a lot more of in the future.
And Chris, really quickly, can you just explain what entitlement costs are?
Yeah, I mean, entitlement process, so it's going through the planning department, getting your sketch plan, site plan review, all of the local government requirements, going through that process. It's very, time intensive and costly. So that's what entitlements is. And this is another new tool we have. Andrew, Council President Friedson touched on it. It's called the Housing Opportunities Housing Production Fund. And the county has provided over $100 million towards this now. And it's really meant to reduce HOC's reliance on the low-income housing tax credits that Patrick mentioned, where it's a competitive process and each state gets the funding kind of trickles down from the federal government to the states, and the states decide how projects are, it's a competitive process, how the projects are awarded. And historically speaking, only one project from Montgomery County gets funded every year. And the equity that we get from the low-income housing tax credits, it's only enough to, on average, fund 50 units of affordable housing. So only relying on low-income housing tax credits, we are never going to solve our housing crisis in Montgomery County if we're, reliant on the low-income housing tax credit. So HOC, and I think that the county council has shown like a lot of foresight in not being reliant upon that. So HOC is kind of has this internal tool that it can use to self-fund project, and they have to, of course, identify other funding. It's just one piece of the funding pie. But it allows them to kind of not be tied down to low-income housing tax credits, because that's a very lengthy process. It can be, it can take you 6 months to apply, and you wait another 6 months to hear back. And then if you don't get the tax credits, you have to wait a whole another calendar year to apply again. And this predates me a little bit, but MHP, we had a project die. It was actually right next to the new county office building in Wheaton, where we had proposed there's still like a surface parking lot next to that county office building. And we had tried to get low-income housing tax credits and were unsuccessful. I think we might have applied even twice, and the project died as a result. And so today you still have a surface parking lot there. So that just kind of goes to show you, I mean, low-income housing tax credits, they have their advantages and disadvantages, and that's one of them when we're really relying on it. And then just another slide on the Housing Production Fund. This kind of shows you what some of the requirements are. Generally speaking, projects that are developed through this tool, they have slightly a higher number or percentage of market rate units to affordable units. And that's, how they kind of make the numbers work and the funding work. Whereas you see like that last bullet point there, projects that are funded through like traditional means like the HIF, they tend to be a little bit more affordable on average with the unit breakdown. But one really cool thing about the Housing Production Fund, while it's mostly meant and it has only been used to date to fund HOC projects, it can be used to fund projects of like other developers. And so HOC has actually recently reached out to MHP because it might be a tool that can reduce MHP's reliance on the low-income housing tax credits as well. So I think that's something we're looking forward to having a conversation with. So it's not just exclusive to HOC, even though it has been used so far. And this is another thing that Andrew touched on. This is just something that launched, I guess, like a month ago. This is called the Nonprofit Preservation Fund. It's very much meant to mirror the HOC Housing Production Fund, reduce our reliance on low-income housing tax credits. And the cool thing about it is that it's actually being administered by the Housing Opportunities Commission as opposed to Montgomery County Department of Housing and Community Affairs. And like Andrew said, I think so at the end of the day, sometime in the next fiscal year, it should be about $50 million that's allocated towards it. And the unique thing about it, it's kind of meant to provide medium-term financing. So like it says here, 8 to 10 years. And that's kind of unique. Usually you just have like, the short-term financing 3 years and the long-term financing something like 30 years. Whereas this is unique because sometimes if you're just going like that traditional short-term, long-term, you usually do have to rely on, again, like on the low-income housing tax credits when you're talking about like the long-term financing. So this gives you a little bit more time. This is mostly meant for acquisition, less rehab of existing affordable housing. So it's just a new tool we have, and it'll be very cool to kind of see this play out over the coming years. Yeah, and it'll be like all the other programs, it's a revolving fund. And this is kind of like Patrick touched on this a little bit. This is kind of like a non-traditional financing tool, but it's very relevant. It's payment in lieu of taxes, also called like property tax abatement. So it's not unusual for like an affordable housing or property, maybe like a larger one, maybe that's say 150 units. They might have a county property tax bill, say $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And that's something we have to factor in when we're trying to put together that financing together. We have to understand, what the annual tax bill is. And, if you're doing like over 30 years, that can be millions of dollars. And so what was happening, it used, a couple of decades ago in Montgomery County, like early 2000s, the policy in Montgomery County was to provide an automatic 100% property tax abatement on all affordable housing projects. And then somewhere about 10 years ago during the Leggett administration, there's a switch in the policy, and the property tax abatements were kind of on a case-by-case basis, and you had to negotiate with the HCA. And that created a real problem where it created this very perverse thing where we nonprofit or in any kind of affordable housing provider still had to, get the money together for the taxes. So what we would end up doing, and other affordable housing providers would end up doing, is you would be asking for that money in the form of a loan from Montgomery County, only to repay the county, in taxes. And what that did in essence is it made less funding available. Like it took away that funding from the HIF when it could have been used to fund more actual acquisition or new construction of affordable housing. It was instead being used to fund property taxes for affordable housing developments, and that's not really the purpose of it. So a couple years ago, Council President Friedson helped us revise the policies to again kind of provide a roadmap for how affordable housing can get 100% property tax abatement. It's still a pretty steep, like you can see here, it's like usually 50% of the units have to be reserved for affordable housing. But if by doing this, this especially makes it more possible for affordable housing providers to acquire naturally occurring affordable housing. So if we know our property, we know what our property tax bill is going to be, that enables us, and it's going to be like $0. That enables us to offer more to acquire property than we might otherwise be, and we can be more competitive with, say, like a market rate developer who might also be eyeing a property. So this has been very big. This has actually led to us being able to acquire several properties, one in Wheaton and one in Tacoma Park, that we probably otherwise would not have been able to acquire because of this new policy. And this is not a county financing tool, but I did want to touch on this. This is another it's a gap financing tool, but it's the state of Maryland's main gap financing tool called Rental Housing Works. And you can see here, usually it provides up to, it used to be a maximum of $2.5 million for each project. Now maybe a year ago, the Department of Housing and Community Development upped it to $3.5 million. And they traditionally like to kind of pair this with projects that are already kind of receiving some other kind of financing, like low-income housing tax credits. And it's really the only tool that the state has for gap financing. And usually the interest rate is the same as what is being provided by the local jurisdiction. I think they have to match. And with my last slide here, I know Montgomery for All is very involved in advocacy, and something I kind of like to highlight for you is that for the entire state of Maryland, Rental Housing Works, the budget is $110 million. And that might sound like a lot, but in reality, for a state of this size, it's really not very much at all. And I've been working really hard to kind of educate elected officials about this. I think we're kind of stuck in kind of old ways of thinking about affordable housing. And I think Montgomery County has definitely stepped up to the plate in terms of doing more. And I think what we need now is for the state to do more, because it's usually an annual thing where there are dozens of projects that are waiting for this rental housing. It's a very small piece of the pie. Whereas like a new construction project with MHPs now, it might be $100 million, but the $3.5 million is a very small piece of the pie, but it's still hugely important because it's so hard to get every last dollar to make a project happen. And every year without fail, the state runs out of money before the end of the fiscal year, and projects are forced to wait months to financially close on a project. And as you might expect, delay usually increase costs significantly for any kind of construction project. So we'd love to, get the help of Montgomery for All and its involvement kind of in this in the future, because it's a really big issue that we face every year. And this is my last slide. It's kind of redundant given Patrick's presentation, but this is kind of an old example of a capital stack, all the different forms of financing we had. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago. It's a little dated, but this was for a rehab project, I believe. And this shows like 8 different sources of financing that we have. But like Patrick said, it's not unusual to have 10, 12, 14 different sources of financing. And touching on one last thing that Patrick was talking about, I would say generally 99% of the financing that we have is in the form of a loan. A very, very small portion are grants. Sometimes we can be lucky, like maybe like I was talking about Rollingwood. I think we had maybe $200,000 grant from Kaiser Permanente. Sometimes with our Forest Glen project, I think we might have had a grant of like $2 million from the Amazon Equity Fund. But those are really hard to come by and not something you can count on. So almost, without fail, like all of our financing is in the form of loans. All of it is repaid back. So I think that's something I didn't appreciate before I really became more involved in affordable housing. I thought, a lot of this is kind of in the form of a grant or a giveaway, but everything is paid back, everything is recycled. So I think that's a strong argument, especially for policymakers that maybe are not really familiar with affordable housing, to really make them aware of that. This is like a great investment because it's a return on investment of government dollars. Yeah. And so thank you for listening. It's really great to join you all. I hope this was informative and not too boring. Thanks.
Yeah,
This was great.
really
Oh,
quick.
sorry. Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh yeah, sorry, Jane. I'm stealing your MC thunder, but I just wanted to say quickly before we go into Q&A that Chris did an excellent job for the Montgomery Housing Alliance this year, organizing tenants to testify for affordable housing funding during the budget hearing. So I just wanted to give Chris a hand for that. It was really, really exciting work. Great to work with Chris at MHA, and of course, yeah, Montgomery for All, I think would be really happy to do some more engagement on budget action next year.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that shout out. I was super impressed when I was waiting. I was the last person to testify at the public hearing, but I didn't even mind because there were so many incredible people sharing their stories about how affordable housing benefited their lives and why the county needed to fund it more. So great job there. Again, thank you to both Chris and Patrick. You do incredible work, and the DC region is very lucky to have you both. Just as we are here tonight. So without further ado, we will do our normal speed run through questions because we never have as much time as we think we're gonna have. First, I wanted to go to a question that was put in the chat from Tushar. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, you can. If not, I'll just read it. Tushar Kansal. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. All right, the question is, given that HIF funding are loans, not grants, where does that $65K in county support come from? Is that because it's below market rate financing?
Yeah, so the 65K, that's like the average that the county, so there are many smaller projects that the county may be providing funding to, say like, like a 4-unit building, where the cost per unit might be a lot less. But when you're dealing with new construction, the costs are going up significantly. So you're saying the question correctly, but yeah, it is in the form of loans. This is the average like subsidy per unit that the county is providing.
And I think it might be worth adding too that even though everything is a loan, it's usually these are loans at terms that like the market wouldn't be lending on, right? They're kind of favorable terms. And so we sometimes call them, they're kind of subsidized loans, right? That these are public loans, but they're not the equivalent of a bank loan. A bank wouldn't be able to make money giving loans out at those terms.
Perfect. Tony, you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. A quick one for you, Patrick. When you said land is valued at highest and best use, in terms of the valuation, is that for tax purposes? Or is it, because I guess maybe I naively thought land is valued for acquisition at basically whatever the market bear, right? So that part I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an appraisal technique, right? So if you were to go get your property appraised, the appraiser would run through like a highest and best use, and they would say, this is your official value of property. It's not for taxes. That's kind of, then you go and show a bank like, hey, you can give me a loan for this value. But really at the core, what it's saying is, if you put this property out on the market, you as a normal seller are going to take whoever gives you the highest price. And this is going to be the sort of person who can give you the highest price, because with their development model, they can support the highest price. So it's really just based on the premise that a seller is going to look for the highest paying offer, and the highest paying offer will be whoever in their development model can spit out the highest land value.
Right. And so I guess it's when you're going for financing, that's the amount you have to use.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And could I just piggyback off of what Patrick was saying? I had like this one anecdote. It's like, I think a lot of the development, the affordable housing development you see in Montgomery County government, developers are looking for opportunities to build on government-owned land, now on houses of worship especially. It's not impossible to develop like on just kind of undeveloped parcels, but as Patrick was saying, if the developer is paying market rate for the land, and then have all like the other construction costs, very quickly a project can not pan out, not be viable. But it's not impossible. Like MHP, we have this one project in North Bethesda that'll be breaking ground in September. It's going to be developed on just an undeveloped piece of land near Pike and Rose. But some other market rate developers we're looking at had like a lot of stormwater concerns, and I think we were only able to acquire because the kind of the value of the land had decreased because other developers were not able to develop it. So I think were it not for like those special considerations, the value of the land would have been too high for us to acquire it.
And Carter.
Oh. Hi. Sorry. My name is Carter Doherty. I live in Tacoma Park. So I had a particular one question related to the seller, because we do have now, with the Tacoma Park minor master plan, the upzoning of the Adventist hospital parcel owned by the Adventist organization. In theory, I could see, is there any history of nonprofit organizations, working effectively with a nonprofit developer to undertake projects where the upfront acquisition costs are lower, precisely because the seller is a nonprofit? And then just a quick question, because all these acronyms, alphabet soup, are sort of rattling through my head now that you've presented about but you did mention, we do advocacy at Montgomery for All. Where is your best advocacy dollar spent? Like where would you most like to see change for the sake of simplifying and enlarging that capital stack?
Not an actual dollar, because we're volunteers and don't get paid for our advocacy. But yes, your metaphor.
I think I might be able to take the first part, and then Chris, if you want to jump on the second. But certainly in terms of nonprofit sellers, yes, that is definitely something we've done a lot, and a lot of affordable housing developers do. I'd say one of the most common ones is working with churches. We've done many partnerships with different churches and Baltimore and DC, who own land, and they're not just looking to make the highest buck, right? They see some social value in it. And that's often one of the kind of few opportunities, right? If you're an affordable housing developer, you're going to look for land that this government owns. You're going to look for a mission-minded landowner who's willing to sell at a below market rate, or you're usually going to look for a very weak market where land values aren't very strong. But that's how you always end up concentrating affordable housing in certain areas. And so I think we still have to solve for that problem. But certainly there is a very long, good track record of nonprofit landowners partnering with developers to build affordable housing.
And I don't see, oh, sorry, yes, Chris, my bad.
No. To the second part of the question, yeah, like as I was saying at the end of my presentation, I think the advocacy is most seen at the state level. I think that's where we have the greatest potential to affect change. Montgomery County government, they're doing great things. I think we can't take it for granted. We definitely need sustained funding. That's kind of the message we're making to Montgomery County government. There's been a lot of, it feels like short-term investments, like it's been really good increases, but it won't mean much if we don't kind of sustain this for a period of years. So that's kind of our message to state, like policymakers in Montgomery County government. But I think there's a lot of education that needs to go on at the state level in terms of what we're doing and where we need to be, and also taking the lead of other states that are being even more progressive than Maryland on affordable housing.
And I see a hand from Tushar.
Hi, me again, and thanks for reading out my question earlier. I was in my sleeping kiddo's bedroom, but I'm out now. Second question here is that my understanding is that in the current high interest rate environment, income restricted or affordable housing is kind of is in some ways more likely to be developed than market rate housing. Not that market rate housing isn't being developed, particularly in a high cost area like DC or this DC region. What is the kind of cause of that? Is it because the financing is, the tax credits are kind of tax credit financing, or, below market rate financing is still available as a policy mechanism? Kind of what leads to that differential? Thanks.
Yeah, I can try taking that one. So I would say in a high interest rate environment, our work definitely gets harder. It doesn't get easier because our loans get smaller and everything becomes more difficult for us as well. We're subject to those macroeconomic conditions. But what's a little unique about affordable housing is that we're somewhat counter-cyclical, right? In that example I was giving about land valuation, where you have these different projects that can pay a lot more money. When real estate is very boom and bust because it is such a debt-focused industry. It is very subject to booms and busts that fluctuate with interest rates much more than other sectors of the economy. And as a result, when you have a bust in the market rate sector, 2008 is actually probably the best example, right? We can go back to a very weak housing market across the country for a long time. Those market rate projects can't pay a lot of money for the land. And so those land prices drop, usually not enough that something you can, easily afford things for a housing developer, but our work is counter-cyclical because then the land prices will drop because there's not a lot of market rate development going on. And then governments are usually looking to spend stimulus money if you're in an economic downturn, and some of that can go into housing programs. So there's a little bit of a counter-cyclical nature. What is incredibly unique right now, and where we've really struggled in DC, is we actually had a boom and then a boom, right? So you had all the stimulus money that was coming through, and DC spent huge amounts of federal stimulus money on affordable housing. We spent $1 billion in our local trust fund. And as a result, we oversubscribed all of our programs. There's now this backlog of projects. So suddenly when the market has now crashed, and it's the time when we're normally counter-cyclical, can go out and actually maybe find landowners who are willing to talk to us because they don't have any other buyers, suddenly we're backlogged because we still have this effect of all the leftover stimulus. So we're in a very unique, unprecedented macroeconomic moment with it.
Some really great questions. Thank you, audience members. We are now past 8:30 here, but I have one question that I want to ask Patrick real quick, if you will entertain me. Is just, what is one thing that DC is doing right that Montgomery County should try to copy?
Yeah, I would say what DC has done very well over the last 10 years especially is making sure that investments are sustained and stable. So it wasn't just, we're going to put in a bunch of money this one time or come with a few programs. When the current mayor came in 2015, the pledge was to put $100 million into our housing production trust fund, which is our key revolving loan gap financing tool, every single year on a stable basis. And what's so key about that, it's not just, oh, that's a lot of money. It's that it creates a stable long-term operating environment. So you can roughly assume that will fund this many projects every single year. I can understand I have this odds of getting funded. I can go out and look for properties. I can look at opportunities, and it creates an industry of kind of specialized developers that work in this that can, stay in business long term, that don't get subject to the booms and busts of the overall market as much. And so that is actually really, really key. Is you want to be careful almost not to just overdo it with one-time bazookas of funding and then go dry for a while. It's actually having a slow and steady state that enables you to build up kind of an ecosystem of folks that can specialize in this work.
I think I saw 2 messages come through the chat here. Okay, Chris was adding. There's a question about plans for affordable housing for the aging population of the county. I mean, just to answer that quickly, I know that there are a lot of nonprofit housing developers that do focus especially on housing for seniors, affordable housing for seniors. I don't know, Chris, if there's anything quickly that you would want to add to that.
Yeah, I feel like maybe a decade ago, there was a lot of senior affordable housing being built, and it feels like we're starting to come back around to that now, especially as there are more houses of worship reaching proactively out to affordable housing providers, and a lot of these houses are specifically interested in senior housing. So I know like we have a couple of kind of senior projects in our pipeline now that would be working with houses of worship. So I think we are kind of on the cusp of seeing an increase in senior affordable housing, where we haven't seen a lot of that in the last couple of years. It's been more just kind of family housing.
And interestingly enough, I wonder if there was any connection between the prominence of senior affordable housing before and the housing moratorium that used to exist, because you could get around the housing moratorium if you built senior housing that didn't have any kids that people thought were going to crowd up the schools. So much more that we could talk about, but we only had so much time here tonight. Really great conversation. I learned a lot. And just based on those questions, it sounds like you all were learning a lot and thinking a lot of interesting thoughts alongside with it. So thanks again. This will be posted on Montgomery for All's YouTube channel. So you can share it with your friends, reference it when you're writing your testimony in the future, talking to other advocates in other places about what we do, that they should do, etc. But stay in touch. We will be sending out emails with upcoming actions related to affordable housing, both affordable housing funding and zoning for more affordable housing types. And again, really appreciative to everybody for being here. Make sure you join Montgomery for All as a member so that our numbers can continue to grow. And with that, I will say good night.
Thanks to you organizers.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks so much, Patrick and Chris. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.